doesn't fit in with the rest of what we've been doing, but I really don't have a place for these guys, so I have to come up with this. So I'm calling this lecture The Artists of Nightmares, and these three guys, Fuseli, Goya, and Daumier, can be seen as the creators of Romanticism in painting. And we will talk about Romanticism in detail a little bit later, but these guys give us the vibe of Romanticism better than any other painters that we'll see later. Romanticism changes into this thing about going into the wilderness and finding yourself, but it starts with these three guys from different countries. Fuseli is Swiss, but he lives in Britain, and many of his works, like The Nightmare, which we're going to look at, deal with like supernatural subject matter. And he believed a certain amount of exaggeration was necessary to create a greater impact on the viewer. And he learned this from looking at Michelangelo's paintings. Goya is a Spanish painter and a printmaker, and throughout his long career, he was a commentator and a chronicler of his era and what life was like in Spain. And we're going to, in this first lecture, first part, we're going to look at Fuseli and Daumier, and then the second part is going to be all about Goya. And Goya deserves a 4-hour lecture, but I'm just going to limit it to about 10 minutes, and we'll do like a deep dive into Goya. And then the last painter is Daumier, and he was a printmaker and a sculptor and a caricaturist. He worked for newspapers, and he was the Voltaire of his time. He was a satirist that made fun of the rich and wealthy and paid a price for it as well. Okay, we're going to begin with Fuseli, and I want you to remember Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill and that Gothic look with the crenellated rooftops and the towers and how it was supposed to look like a medieval building, and I talked a little bit about Gloomth. And this painting sort of encapsulates Gloomth as best any painting can. One of the first things you need to know about Romanticism is that it glorified the irrational side of human nature, including dreams and fantasies. So Romanticism was a reaction against Enlightenment thinking and empiricism and reason and thinking that you can understand everybody, basically embracing irrationality. So this canvas seems to portray simultaneously a dreaming woman and what she is dreaming or having a nightmare about. The incubus is that thing on her chest, and the horse's head refer to the contemporary belief and folklore about nightmares. And the early meaning of nightmare included the sleeper's experience of weight on the chest combined with sleep paralysis or a feeling of dread. This painting incorporates a variety of images associated with these ideas, depicting a mare's head and a demon crouched atop the woman, and her pose suggests a queasy mixture of like pain, but maybe a little pleasure as well. Before we talk any more about this painting, I want to talk a little bit about Fuseli because it informs the painting. There's a story that goes with this, and that is a few years before he painted this, he'd fallen passionately in love with a woman named Anna Landholt in Zurich while he was traveling from Rome to London. And Landholt was a niece of his friend, and he wrote of his fantasies in 1779. He said, very possessive, saying she's mine and I'm hers and I have her I will. And the problem is his love was unrequited. And Landholt married a family friend soon after, and not Fuseli. And so this painting, this nightmare, can be seen as a personal portrayal of the erotic aspects of love lost. So perhaps the sleeping woman represents Anna Landholt, and the demon is Fuseli himself. And then to support this claim, there is an unfinished portrait of a girl on the back of the painting's canvas, which actually might be Anna Landholt. So it's been suggested that the incubus is actually a self-portrait of Fuseli, and he can see that he was smothering this woman by obsessing about her. This painting was really popular, so Fuseli actually made a number of copies. And sometimes he changed the composition, and this creature is called an imp or a Mara, or it could be a demon, but it's often referred to as Mara, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this creature derives from ancient sculpture, but it also alludes to contemporary ideas about savages and half-human simians. And again, some people have speculated that this is a self-portrait. The painter may have been inspired by folklore relating to the Mara, who are spirits that visit in the night causing bad dreams, or classical stories about the incubi, who are wicked imps who assault women sexually in their sleep. Another component of this painting is the horse with those crazy bug eyes. The word nightmare derives from Mara rather than mare from the horse, although these terms get mixed up. And so it's not surprising that when I first told you about this and I said nightmare and you saw that horse and you were like, oh, mare. But it's actually because of the imp rather than the horse. But the prominent presence of this wild-looking horse compounds the confusion. It could be that the imp is going to ride away on the horse, or we're not really sure what the horse's role in this is. It might represent Fuseli, who came to rescue Anna Landholt from the man she eventually marries. So maybe Fuseli is the imp, or maybe he's the crazy horse that's going to bring her away from the imp. There's also a possibility that's a sexual metaphor for penetration. It's also been suggested that this woman is in a drug-induced slumber and that bottle on her nightstand there is laudanum, which is a form of opium. But in the end, this is a creepy painting, and it really resonated with people, and it was the antithesis of all those other paintings I showed you in Britain in the 1700s. It was different than Joseph Wright's scientific discovery paintings. It was different from neoclassicism. It had an air about it that was startling and attractive to people and would look quite at home on the cover of any of those Edgar Allan Poe poetry anthologies. Okay, I want to move on from that creepy thing. This is an inkwash drawing that Fuseli did, and it's called The Artist Moved to Despair at the Grandeur of Antique Fragments. And the question is, why are you so sad, artist? What's the despair caused by? And the answer might be the impossibility of emulating the greatness of the past. An artist looks at, this is from the statue of Constantine the Great. So this artist is there studying in Rome and sees that I'll never be as good as the ancient Romans. And the knowledge that all things must decay, or maybe there's a sense of unfulfilled longing and dislocation. We're not really sure the exact reason that the artist is moved to despair, but it could be a number of things. And it's basically just this melancholy that comes from understanding your mortality. There's distortions of perspective. And if you look all the way to the right of this inkwash, you'll see this big swath of darkness. And that might be this idea that we'll never know. That's this unknown element, another thing to despair about. I mean, the idea that there's any emotion at all in this shows how different it is from neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is all about stoicism and not being too emotional, and romanticism is like, bring on the emotion. Like, I'm going to cry while my hand is on this giant statue foot thing, because I am emotional. I am a human, and I'm irrational, and I'm emotional. And that's what Fuseli really wants to get across, is that we are people, not mythological gods or ancient thinkers. And we have to make our peace with that. Okay, I'm going to end this with a couple of etchings by Daumier. And even though this is much later than Fuseli, and we're not even here yet when we're talking about the French, we're still sort of discussing Napoleon and neoclassicism and propaganda, Daumier fits into this mold of taking an honest look at human irrationality and pointing out these behaviors when it's necessary to point them out. So here's the story with this crazy drawing. So during the reign of Louis Philippe, who was 25 years after Napoleon, Daumier joins the staff of a newspaper called Le Caricature, and he starts on this pictorial campaign of satire, and he targets the foibles and the corruption of the bourgeoisie and the law and the incompetence of the government. And he portrays the king as Gargantua, and this actually led to his imprisonment for 6 months in 1832. But he depicts the monarch, Louis Philippe. He's seated on a throne, and he's gobbling up bags of coins that are being hauled up a ramp by tiny laborers. And the coins have been wrung from the poor of France by the ministers. And on the lower right, there's a crowd of poverty-stricken subjects that stand waiting miserably to turn over what little money they have. And then milling around sort of underneath the throne are his favorites. And they're extravagantly fat, and they're collecting commissions, decorations, and so forth that are the results of all the offerings of the poor. And if you consider that the throne is kind of like a toilet, you can imagine where these honors and decorations are coming from by Louis Philippe. And again, this is meant to show how people are not rational and how by embracing rationality we got to this point. The last image I want to look at from Daumier is this one called the Rue Transnonain, or Transnonain. And it's a disturbing image that was meant to commemorate the murder by the National Guard of innocent civilians during widespread unrest in Paris during the month of April 34. So what you should know is after the French Revolution, there were like 5 other big government uprisings and republics and revolutions, and a lot didn't really play itself out until after World War II, basically. So in 1834, there was this massacre of innocents in this building. The artist typically relied on exaggeration. We saw like the weird head of the king in the last thing, but in this one, there's no exaggeration needed. This print features several victims that are caught in the crossfire of a massacre, and the man is dressed only in a nightshirt, and that's the central figure, and he's slumped over and surrounded by overturned furnitures. And there's also this foreshortening that we've seen in other paintings, in which it's an artist's tool in order to make a body look like it's coming out at you. There is a streak of dramatic light that casts a spotlight on him, which we all now know of as chiaroscuro or tenebrism, as if it's the haunting grand finale of like a tragic play. And underneath him is a body of a child. It's hard to tell, but like he's on top of a child that's also been murdered. And to the left of him is another body, to the right is another dead body. And what's striking about this is just how kind of quiet it is. You don't need to see the massacre happening, but the aftermath of the massacre is enough to really move you. And it did. A lot of people saw this, and they were really moved by the horror of it. We've seen this where horrific images of death can be really moving to people and can move them to act. And that's what Daumier was trying to do with this drawing. I would like to end on a more positive note, but we're going to look at Goya next. This is a painting by him. And things just get even more sad. So just prepare yourself for more melancholy, nightmares, and sadness to come.